For 93 years, every single Converse sneaker sold in America was made by American hands in an American factory. Then, over the course of a few brutal months, that ended forever, and 475 people in Massachusetts found out their entire industry had disappeared overnight. This is the story of how the company that invented the basketball sneaker lost its own country. A shoe company that never meant to make sneakers. In February 1908, a 47-year-old man named Marquis Mills Converse opened a small rubber shoe operation in Malden, Massachusetts. He had spent years managing a footwear manufacturing firm in Boston and understood the rubber business inside and out. His new company had nothing to do with basketball, nothing to do with sport, nothing to do with what Converse would eventually become world famous for. The Converse Rubber Shoe Company made galoshes, winterized rubber-soled boots. At one point, the company even manufactured automobile tires. It was a practical, unglamorous operation, serving practical, unglamorous needs, keeping people's feet dry in the New England winter. There was just one problem with that business model. It was seasonal. Rubber boots and galoshes sold in the fall, winter, and spring. Come summer, the demand disappeared, and Converse had a factory full of skilled workers with nothing to make. So Converse made a decision that would change footwear history entirely, though nobody involved had any idea of that at the time. To keep his workforce employed through the summer months, he started making canvas tennis shoes. Simple, lightweight, rubber-soled shoes that filled the production gap and kept the Malden factory running year-round. By 1916, that side project had evolved into something more focused. Converse turned its attention specifically to performance basketball footwear. In 1917, the company released a shoe built specifically for the emerging sport of basketball, at a time when basketball itself was still little more than a peach basket nailed to a gymnasium wall. That shoe was called the All-Star. Nobody at Converse in 1917 understood they had just created what would become the single most recognized sneaker silhouette in human history. The decision had been made purely to solve a seasonal staffing problem. There was no grand vision, no market research, no strategic plan to dominate a sport that barely existed yet in its modern form. It was a practical solution to keep skilled workers employed through the summer months, and it happened to produce one of the most enduring products in the history of American manufacturing. The salesman who became a legend. The All-Star sold reasonably well in its early years, but it was about to receive the single greatest marketing boost any product could ask for, and it would not come from an advertising campaign. It would come from a basketball player nobody outside the sport had heard of. Charles Hollis, Chuck Taylor, was a semi-professional basketball player who genuinely loved the All-Star shoe. He joined Converse as a salesman in 1921, working out of the company's Chicago sales office, and he did something that almost no athlete endorsement of that era had ever attempted. He traveled the country, high schools, colleges, amateur leagues, anywhere people played basketball, running clinics, talking to coaches, and personally promoting the shoes he believed in. Taylor was not a hired spokesperson reading from a script. He was a genuine evangelist for the product. He understood the game at a technical level and could speak to coaches and players about footwear in a way that built real trust. That trust translated directly into sales. By 1932, Converse had added Chuck Taylor's signature to the ankle patch of the All-Star, officially renaming what had been a generic basketball shoe into something that would carry his name for the next century. The Chuck Taylor All-Star, known to generations of Americans simply as Chucks, was born. By the 1950s, Converse had achieved something close to a complete monopoly on basketball footwear. If you played organized basketball anywhere in America during this era, you were almost certainly wearing Converse. Photos from basketball courts across the country in this period show rows of players, every single one in Chuck Taylors. There was no meaningful competition. Converse was basketball footwear. The cultural icon. What happened next elevated Converse beyond sport entirely. The All-Star became one of the defining visual symbols of mid-century American culture. Elvis Presley wore them. James Dean wore them. They were on the feet of basketball legends like Bill Russell and later Julius Dr. J. Irving, who helped carry the brand's basketball credibility into a new generation. They showed up in television and film, on characters that represented a kind of effortless, all-American cool. Dennis the Menace, Punky Brewster, the cast of sitcoms that defined what ordinary American life looked like to audiences across the country. This was not the result of a deliberate marketing strategy in the way modern brands think about cultural placement. It happened organically, because the shoe genuinely was everywhere, in gym lockers, on playgrounds, in military footlockers during World War II, when Converse shifted significant production toward military footwear for American soldiers. That World War II chapter mattered more than people often realize. Converse did not just survive the war. It became part of the fabric of what American manufacturing meant during the war effort. The factory in Malden was not just making sneakers anymore. It was contributing to a national project, and the workers there understood their work carried that weight. By the time the post-war boom hit, Converse occupied a position that very few American brands have ever held. It was simultaneously the dominant performance product in its category, and a genuine cultural touchstone recognized across every demographic in the country. The cracks nobody wanted to see. For decades, Converse's dominance in basketball felt unshakable. And then, starting in the 1970s, it started to crack. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The core problem was design stagnation. Converse had built an empire on a canvas, rubber-soled shoe that had barely changed since the 1920s. That simplicity had been the product's strength for 50 years. But as the 1970s progressed, a new generation of athletic shoe companies began bringing genuine technological innovation to performance footwear. Better cushioning, better support, materials engineered specifically for the biomechanics of basketball, rather than simply canvas and rubber, assembled the same way they had been for half a century. Adidas brought European athletic engineering credibility. Puma followed with its own technical innovations. And then came the company that would ultimately define the next 50 years of athletic footwear entirely. Nike, founded in 1964, initially as a distributor for Japanese running shoes, before evolving into the innovation-driven powerhouse that would eventually, ironically, become Converse's owner. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, these competitors did something Converse had never had to do before. They out-engineered the product. Reebok arrived with its own technical case for superiority. Basketball players who had worn Chucks their entire careers started switching to shoes that offered genuine ankle support. Cushioned soles designed for the specific impact patterns of basketball, and materials that performed better under real athletic stress. Converse's response was too slow. The company that had built basketball footwear from nothing struggled to convince anyone that it understood the modern athlete's needs. By the time genuine performance basketball shoes from Nike and other competitors had captured the professional and serious amateur market, Converse had been pushed almost entirely out of the category it had invented. The ownership carousel. What made Converse's decline even harder to manage was a brutal pattern of ownership changes that started well before the final collapse. Converse had actually filed for bankruptcy once before, back in 1929, during the early days of the Great Depression. The company survived that crisis through new leadership and recovered to build the cultural dominance it would later achieve. But the corporate instability that began in the later 20th century was different and far more damaging. Converse changed hands repeatedly. Eltra Corporation owned the company from 1972 to 1979. Then Allied Corporation took over from 1979 to 1982. Then Interco held the brand from 1986 to 1994. Each ownership transition brought new management philosophies, new cost structures, new strategic priorities. And each transition pulled focus and resources away from the kind of sustained product investment that competitors like Nike were pouring into their own basketball lines. By the time Apex One took ownership in the late 1990s, Converse was a company carrying mounting debt with a product line that had fallen years behind its competitors technologically. The brand still had genuine cultural cachet. The Chuck Taylor remained recognizable everywhere. But cultural recognition does not pay down corporate debt, and the basketball performance category that had once been Converse's exclusive domain now belonged almost entirely to other companies. Through the late 1990s, Converse pushed hard into international licensing deals, strengthening positions in markets like Japan and Canada, trying to find revenue anywhere it could. In 1999, the company even introduced a helium cushioned shoe in a last attempt to generate technical excitement around the brand. None of it was enough. The debt kept growing. The basketball category kept shrinking. And the broader sneaker market itself was shifting away from basketball shoes entirely as consumer preference moved toward boots and other footwear categories by the end of the decade. January 22nd, 2001. The end, when it came, arrived with brutal speed. Industry analysts had been watching Converse's finances deteriorate for months. The company had racked up roughly $180 million in debt. It had already gone through rounds of layoffs. It had missed a $25 million financing deadline. Its stock, once trading above $28 a share in the late 1990s, had collapsed to 50 cents. On January 22nd, 2001, under the ownership of Apex One, Converse officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company immediately announced its plan to close its 3 remaining North American factories and shift all production to manufacturing facilities in Asia. This was not a gradual transition planned over years. This was an immediate, structural decision made as part of the bankruptcy restructuring itself. The kind of decision that gets made in a conference room with lawyers present, far away from the people whose lives it would actually affect. The largest of those factories, the one that had been producing Chuck Taylor All-Stars for decades, churning out between 8 and 10 million pairs of shoes every single year, officially closed its doors on a Saturday in late March 2001. 475 workers were sent home for the final time. After that closure, for the first time in 93 years, no Converse shoe sold anywhere in the world would carry a Made in USA stamp on its heel. The company that had built basketball footwear from a seasonal rubber boot side hustle, that had clothed soldiers during a world war, that had been worn by Bill Russell and Kurt Cobain, and an entire century of American cultural icons, no longer had a single factory operating on American soil. What those 475 people lost. It is easy, looking at this story purely through a business lens, to see the closure as an inevitable consequence of cost competition and outdated product design. And in pure financial terms, that assessment is not wrong. But the 475 workers who walked out of that Massachusetts factory for the final time were not abstractions in a bankruptcy filing. Many of them had worked there for decades. Many had parents or grandparents who had worked in the same building, in the same industry, in the same New England manufacturing tradition that had defined the region's economy for generations. These were people who understood exactly what they were making and exactly what it meant. They were not assembling generic commodity footwear. They were making the Chuck Taylor All-Star, a shoe with a direct lineage back to 1917, a shoe that had been on the feet of basketball legends and rock stars and millions of ordinary American kids learning to play the game in driveways and playgrounds across the country. When that factory closed, those workers did not just lose a paycheck. They lost a connection to a piece of American cultural history that they had personally been responsible for producing. The skills they had developed, the specific knowledge of how to construct a canvas and rubber sneaker to exacting specification, refined over decades of institutional experience, had no easy transfer to other industries. Sneaker manufacturing in America was not just declining at Converse. It was disappearing as a viable career path entirely, as the broader athletic footwear industry had already completed its own migration to overseas manufacturing years earlier. The bankruptcy court did not weigh any of this in its calculations. It could not. Bankruptcy proceedings exist to resolve debt, not to account for the erosion of an industrial tradition or the personal cost to the people caught inside it. The strange and complicated ending. What happened to Converse after the bankruptcy is almost as strange as the collapse itself. The brand survived. Footwear acquisitions took ownership following the restructuring, operating Converse as a marketing and licensing entity rather than a manufacturer, designing products and overseeing production that now happened entirely overseas, while focusing the company's actual operations on brand management and distribution deals. And then, in 2003, came the twist that nobody could have scripted. Nike, the very company whose technical innovation had helped drive Converse out of serious basketball competition decades earlier, purchased Converse for $309 million. The competitor that had played a direct role in ending Converse's manufacturing dominance was now its owner. Under Nike's stewardship, Converse was rebuilt not as a performance basketball brand, but as something different entirely, a lifestyle and fashion brand, leaning fully into the cultural cachet that had always existed alongside its athletic functionality. The Chuck Taylor All-Star, the shoe that had once defined basketball courts across America, became instead a fashion staple, worn by people who had no intention of ever playing organized basketball in them. It worked, commercially. By 2023, Converse was generating $2.4 billion in annual revenue under Nike's ownership. The brand exists today in 136 locations worldwide. The Chuck Taylor remains instantly recognizable, arguably more globally ubiquitous now as a fashion item than it ever was as a basketball shoe. But none of that revenue flows back to Malden, Massachusetts. None of it employs the workers and their families who built the company's reputation over 93 years of American manufacturing. The shoes that generate billions in revenue today are made overseas, on production lines with no connection to the Massachusetts factory floor, where Marquis Mills Converse first decided to keep his summer workers employed by making tennis shoes. The irony sits at the center of the entire story. The brand that Nike helped push out of relevance became one of Nike's most reliable revenue sources, while the physical place where that brand was born continued fading quietly out of the picture entirely. What got left behind? Converse's story is not unique in American manufacturing history. It follows a pattern that played out across dozens of industries through the second half of the 20th century. Domestic production unable to compete on cost against overseas manufacturing, technological innovation arriving too slowly to defend market position, corporate ownership changing hands too many times for any sustained strategic investment to take hold. But there is something particularly stinging about Converse's version of this story because of what the product actually represented. This was not an anonymous industrial component or a commodity good. This was the Chuck Taylor All-Star, a shoe that millions of Americans had a genuine personal relationship with, that carried specific cultural and athletic meaning across multiple generations. The factory in Malden made more than shoes. It made the physical objects that people wore while they learned to play basketball, while they formed their first sense of personal style as teenagers, while they stood on stages as musicians, defining entire genres. Every pair that came off those production lines carried a small piece of an American manufacturing tradition that had started with rubber galoshes and somehow became one of the most recognized cultural symbols the country ever produced. That tradition ended on a Saturday in March 2001, when 475 people walked out of a building for the last time. Subscribe if stories like this one matter to you, because there are more of them, American factories, American workers, and American products that the rest of the world simply moved on from, without ever properly saying goodbye.